Welcome to Not So Quiet on the Western Front, the podcast where we lift the lid, bust the myths, and explore the incredible history of the First World War. I'm Dan Hill, a military historian and battlefield guide specialising in the history of the war on the Western Front.
And I'm Dr. Spencer Jones, author and senior lecturer in war studies at the University of Wolverhampton. In this episode, we'll look at the highly controversial and often much misunderstood story of the frontal assault on the trenches of the Western Front. We'll consider why and how it happened, if it was as haphazard and pointless as we are commonly led to believe, and address the popular belief that Allied commanders repeatedly sent brave men walking across no man's land in futile attacks against enemy machine guns. Well, hi Dan. Today we're tackling one of, I think, the most enduring images of the First World War. And this is the image of brave men, usually Allied soldiers, be they British Empire, French or American, leaving their trenches and advancing slowly against the enemy in frontal assaults that are often doomed to fail, and frontal assaults that are launched time and time again. And we talked previously on the episodes about the idea of futility within the First World War and a memory of futility. And I think a lot of this memory that the efforts of the armies were ultimately futile and terribly wasteful in life is anchored on this idea that all the attacks looked exactly the same. But it's not quite the case, is it?
Yeah, hi Spence. It's going to be one of those subjects that I think is, in a way, is frustrating for a historian because, of course, the short answer and, bit of an early spoiler alert here is, of course, no, it's not always the same. There's so much versatility and differences, sometimes for better, sometimes for worse, which come about as a result of the fighting on the Western Front. And long-time listeners, I'm sure, will be well aware of this by now. But if you were to ask somebody in the street and you were to ask them to explain something about the First World War or something that they knew about the First War, particularly in Britain, and there's a particular program which came out in the 1980s and 90s, I think, which we can hold largely to blame for much of this school of thought. A lot of people will tell you that the First World War is really known for sending men slowly walking towards machine guns time after time and expecting a different result. Now, the reality is we can look at this and I think we can really address that myth. And I do think that is a myth in this case. And we can put it to bed. And I think in the same breath, really, Spence, do justice to the lads that fought in that war, because it's not fair, I think, to tar everybody with this brush of stupidity and utter futility. The guys fighting it certainly didn't feel that way. And the guys that ultimately emerged victorious from it certainly didn't fight it that way. So, it's an interesting topic and one that I'm really looking forward to getting into.
It certainly is an interesting topic, and it's one that also speaks to the complexity of the First World War, because listeners, I'm sure by the fact you're tuning into this podcast, you've got a deep interest in the war, and whether you're new to this series or whether you've been tuning in for all our episodes, you know that there's a lot we like to talk about that it challenges common perception. And it's interesting to me that the common perception of these futile frontal attacks began very, very early, perhaps even during the war itself, because if you took part in a frontal attack, and we'll get on to why there's so many of these in just a moment, if you took part in a frontal attack and it failed, as many attacks did, then inevitably you begin to question the logic of why you've been launched into this assault and what had happened. And this gradually began to drift back into the home fronts of the Allied nations, began to be spread, really began to take hold in 1917 as the morale in both the French and the British armies became lower. Started to emerge in American armies in late 18 when they begin to experience it too. So it is being generated from the front by, of course, men who've experienced it. But then the 20s and 30s, as gradually the mood turns against the First World War, it starts getting promoted more and more and more. And crucially, and this is an important part, listeners, crucially, an image is created that there was a better way to do this, that there was a more intelligent, more sophisticated way, if only the generals had been clever enough to see it. And nobody promoted this image more than former British Prime Minister David Lloyd George, who published his memoirs in the 1930s that were phenomenally popular across the English-speaking world, the British Empire, and even in the United States. And David Lloyd George, an extremely good orator, very good writer, he really pushed this idea that the generals had been wedded to constant futile frontal assaults. He described it, in fact, as a disease of the mind that affected all the Allied commanders. And in his memoirs, he hinted at that there were better ways to do this. What if there'd been an attack in Italy? What if there'd been an attack in the Balkans? What if there had been naval landings? He put into place all these little subtle ideas without really explaining how they're going to work, but he put them into place. And this then gripped the imagination and contributed to this very powerful idea that this was all that had been done. And there was some truth in this. There was some truth in this because for most of the war on the Western Front, every single attack has to be frontal. And the reason for that, Dan, is the entire Western Front cannot be outflanked.
Yeah, and this is one of the big questions and comments that I hear and see a lot on the battlefields, actually. When you take people out to the Western Front, you say, well, why on earth didn't they just go round the side? Why did they have to attack through this stretch of ground? Well, the short answer is they didn't necessarily have to attack through that stretch of ground. You can move 1,000 yards to your left. You're still attacking somebody else frontally, though. The Western Front is over 400 miles long. There are no flanks to speak of. So at some point, somebody has to go straight forward through an enemy line in a typical frontal assault. The 1st of July 1916, that no doubt we'll cover in this episode in a bit of detail, is a great example. People would say, and I take groups out to Beaumont Hamel, where the 1st Battalion Lancashire Fusiliers go over the top that morning, and you ask people, well, what would you do in this scenario? This is the situation in front of you, and you can draw the picture, and you can point out the key machine gun positions. Almost all of the time, somebody will say, well, I'd attack over there around the left-hand side. Well, if you move 1,000 yards left, you've got exactly the same problem, just with a different company or a different battalion. Somebody else is fighting their own frontal assault in that location. And this is a big part of the problem of the war on the Western Front generally. The fact that, in effect, you're fighting a flankless war. Now, this isn't quite true, because actually once you get into the attack, and particularly into enemy lines, you absolutely have flanks. And in fact, they're a big problem when you're trying to break through an enemy position. But in terms of actually getting across no man's land, and that's if we can assume the fact now that the Allies do have to get across no man's land, which is another point that's sometimes put forward. In fact, we addressed last time out, why attack at all? Let's assume that we can agree that the attacks have to go on, and hopefully those of you that tuned into our last episode will agree with that point. Then if that's got to happen, it's got to be frontal.
It really does, because there is simply no other option. And there is another option, which we discussed in our previous episode, which is do nothing. But that, for very, very pertinent political reasons, is completely unacceptable, not least to the French, who are, of course, fighting to liberate their country. And so if you have to attack on the Western Front, no matter where you attack, you are going to be entering into a form of frontal attack. And the tragedy can be extended further, because it's often said, and this was a very popular line of thought that was being produced in the English-speaking world in the 1960s and the 1970s, in the literature, which often regarded the First World War era with a sort of jaded cynicism. It was very fashionable to denigrate the mindset of the First World War in the 1960s and 70s in the English-speaking world. And it's often said, why do the generals constantly throw their troops not merely into frontal assault, but against the toughest sectors of the Western Front, the most heavily defended sectors? Well, there's a really simple answer for that, and that's the most heavily defended sectors were heavily defended because they were protecting something important. And if you captured that something important, be it a ridge or a series of ridges, it's nearly always fighting over high ground, then that could potentially unlock the entire Western Front, or at least put you in a much stronger position as the Allies to drive the Germans out of the country. The one possible exception is the Battle of the Somme in 1916, where the British find themselves assaulting an extremely tough part of the German front, largely so the British can fight alongside the French. We've discussed that in our previous Somme episode. But generally, these factors, the essential need to launch a frontal assault because there is no flanks to turn, combined with attacking strong points on the Western Front. And though we may look at this and say, well, this seems self-defeating, from a general perspective, if you have to launch a frontal assault, which we've established you do, that's the only way to attack on the Western Front, then if you're going to commit the ammunition and the manpower to do this, why not attack in an area where if you break through or you capture the ground, you're going to achieve something really important? But of course, the problem is the Germans aren't stupid. They know what's important in their trench system. And the areas where the Allies are most interested in attacking, they're going to be the most heavily defended sectors. And this leads to various tragic battles. I'm thinking particularly the French assault at Vimy Ridge in 1915. I'm thinking the Third Battle of Ypres, Passchendaele in 1917. And you see this again and again where the fighting is extremely intense precisely because the Allies are trying to capture important ground.
Yeah, it's a good point, and I think to even take it back to its basics for a moment, just to kind of to set out the idea of what's involved in a frontal assault, or what the aim of a frontal assault at its most basic level needs to be, and it takes us back, of course, to that famous trifecta. It's machine guns, artillery, and barbed wire. It's breaching those three defensive mechanisms, two of them active, one of them passive, getting through the enemy position, as you say, Spence, threatening something important, making the enemy react, opening opportunities, not in the front lines, but beyond them. It's break in versus break through. And this is something that we find that the Allies really struggle with achieving, really up until 1918. But also, we need to consider the major factors here in terms of going over the top and the mechanics of it and what's trying to be achieved by those that are doing it. Now, the main thing, or one of the main things, and this isn't true throughout the entire war, actually, as attritional warfare comes in more in the second half of the war, you could argue that it's taken out of the loop to a certain extent. But the need to take ground, whether it's small or whether it's large, is pretty much ever present. Some cases it's a larger factor, in some cases it's a lesser one. What becomes more of a factor is the need to inflict casualties on the enemy whilst you're doing so. This becomes a bigger issue as we come later in the war, particularly when the German army starts to become more strapped for manpower. And the other thing that needs to be achieved at the same time is that the attackers need to protect their own troops in doing so. There's no point launching an attack and inflicting 1,000 casualties on the enemy if it costs you 10,000 guys to do it. And there are battles where that happens, particularly in 1915 on the Western Front. But these are the main things that need to be considered. And there are ways that you can, if you like, you can shift that balance of power. Now, some of these come in early, Spence, and we see some of them are effective. Some of them are effective, surprisingly so, looking at things like the first German use of gas. Other ones, they're not really going to come into their own until 1917 or 1918, and that's when we start to see the big changes on the Western Front.
This is true, and just to add some emphasis to what you've said, Dan, about this need to launch a frontal assault, which is no other way unless you don't attack, combined with the need to inflict damage on your enemy, because in 1915 especially, too often the balance of casualties is so disproportionately weighted against the Allies that it's quite clear if the Allies continue with these methods, if they don't improve these methods, they're going to run out of men long before the Germans do. I'm thinking particularly of the disastrous Anglo-Indian attack at Ober's Ridge in May 1915, where there's somewhere in the region of 11,500 British and Indian casualties. In return, perhaps 1,500 German casualties. So absolutely staggering imbalance of casualties there that can't be sustained. And there's methods, in fact, much innovation, much improvement to method in the Allied armies through 15, 16, 17 and beyond is about how to make a frontal attack work. And they have to find a way because there's no, as we've established, you can't outflank the Western Front. And if you want to break through, if you want to liberate your country, you're going to have to find a way through. And a criticism that's been made of the constant use of frontal attacks is that the generals generally just keep scaling up the same method. And there's a terrific novel, listeners, if you're interested in this, by C.S. Forester, who's most famous for writing the Hornblower novels. He wrote a novel in the 1930s called The General, which is about a fictitious British commander on the Western Front who is trying to master warfare effectively. It's quite a poignant book. In some ways, it is a lions led by donkeys book. But in that, there's a section where the character, the main character, a guy called Curzon, is remembering the assaults in 1915 and saying, well, they all went wrong. But in 1916, we've got so much more artillery. We have so much more resources. We've got so many more men. This time it's going to work. And Forrester plays on this and describes it as the group of generals as people who are trying to open a crate. They're trying to open a crate, but they've never encountered a screwdriver. So they don't know how to remove the screws. And so they're just constantly trying to prise the lid off with brute force, when if they'd had a screwdriver, they could have opened it very easily. And it's a subtle, playful metaphor in some ways that would have appealed to a general reader in the 1930s. But what it neglects is that in 1915, 16, and 17, nobody's encountered this level of fortification in history, as we've established in previous episodes. And the methods available to them, well, they're still quite crude. As we said on the barbed wire episode, even cutting barbed wire in 1916 is haphazard. Tanks are only just starting to appear in late 1916. They're very, very crude. Artillery itself is firing with often unreliable fuses. 1 in 5 shells aren't detonating. What the generals are trying to do is they are trying to make the most of what they have. And the tragedy of the First World War is that until really late 1917 and into 1918, what both armies have is never quite enough to really break open the front and do what the armies hope, which is to break open the Western Front and restore mobility to this. And so you're forced to fight with what you have. And there is innovation. Contrary to what Sears Forrester gets across in the novel, contrary to what critics have argued, there is innovation. We've traced a lot of this innovation in our studies of individual campaigns, but the pace of this innovation is not fast enough to completely and decisively alter the picture of the Western Front. And it's that which in many ways leads to these constant casualties and the tragedy in some ways of the fact that perhaps to a soldier's eye, certainly perhaps now as we look back, it seems to us that the generals are just trying to do the same thing over and over again. But in actual fact, each year of battle looks rather different from the last one, Dan.
Yeah, and I would even argue each month of battle, and occasionally each week or even day of battle looks very different. 1916 onwards, we see a huge amount of change. And the reason is obvious, because the stakes are enormously high. No general, no matter how bad an opinion we have of certain generals in the Great War, no general wants to lose half his division on a single morning. It is absolutely unsustainable. Nobody lose their men actively. It just simply doesn't happen. People want to husband these resources, and the most delicate resource that there is out on the Western Front in 1914 to 1918 are the men. These guys are very susceptible to fire. They're very susceptible to illness and injury. They need to be fed. They need to be looked after. These are a really valuable resource. They're the guys that are ultimately going to win the war. But in order to do that, we need to remember that Private Atkins, at the heart of this, needs to be able to get from point A to point B, which includes crossing no man's land and getting into the enemy trench. Now, the Allies need to make that as easy a prospect as possible. So there's a couple of ways that they can look at this, and it's all part of the learning curve that we see in 1915 and 1916 particularly. And that's, okay, well, do we, in order to give Tommy Atkins the best chance of getting across no man's land, do we literally wipe the enemy off the map in the first place? Or do we provide covering fire? Or do we bring out new methods that are going to surprise or deceive the enemy in some way? And this is where we see the employment of things like smoke screens, machine gun and artillery barrages, creeping barrages, which are going to come in a little bit later on. We're going to use poison gas. Flamethrowers are going to be used on the German side. There's any number of things that are brought in to try and swing the odds in that pretty gruesome battle that's going on in trying to get that soldier from point A to point B. Now, the stakes, as we say, are incredibly high. The problem that you get is in this proverbial game of poker where you're putting those chips down, those men's lives, to see if you can win a small advance or perhaps even a large one, is that if you get it wrong, sometimes it goes very, very wrong. But I think the point that's really important to make and emphasize here, Spence, is that doing the same thing, identical thing, again and again, is, if not completely unheard of, almost unheard of during the Great War. I can't personally think, with the exception perhaps once of the first and second days of the Battle of Loos in 1915, of where a carbon copy, no change, except slightly worse conditions for the attacker, goes in day after another. I can't really think of anywhere where the same thing happens repeatedly, expecting a different outcome.
No, and it's certainly tempting, and I think it comes from this this memory that we discussed earlier in the episode, to think that it does, that it is done again and again in the same way. Certainly there are poorly planned and poorly implemented attacks on the Western Front. There are serious mistakes can be made, and the tragedy, of course, is when you make a mistake on the Western Front as a commander, it's going to cost lives, and it's going to cost a lot of lives. And it's often going to cost a lot of lives in the most appalling of ways, with soldiers unable to get very far out of their trenches, not given a fair chance. But you've made a great point about these attacks evolve and they change, and there are tremendous efforts made to try and make frontal attacks work. And it's essential that they do, because otherwise you cannot breach the Western Front. You will never liberate France and Belgium. You will never win the First World War. There has to be a way to do this. And so much innovation, whether it's tactical, material, or in terms of plans and commands, is anchored on well, how do we make these frontal attacks work? You made a great point about all this equipment coming in, all these new methods coming in, all these new ideas trying to be implemented. And some of these ideas just don't work. They're not efficient, or they have problems. They do not allow a break-in. There's certainly, I think, in Allied command for a long time, especially British command, there is a fixation on the idea of breaking through the trenches when that's not really possible. And I think the generals perhaps focus on that for too long. But one of the reasons they focus on that is this is the answer to the problem we're discussing. If you can break up the Western Front, and the general feeling is you only need one really big attack that cracks the Western Front, and the rest of the front will begin to crumble and it will become mobile. If you can do that, you're going to solve the problem we're discussing, constantly frontally assaulting the enemy, who's in a very, very strong defensive position, covered with barbed wire trenches and machine guns and so forth. And so, can we forgive the generals for going for this? Well, perhaps, because if you're going to throw tens of thousands of men at a position, and they're going to take casualties no matter what you do, no matter how good your attack is, they're going to take casualties. Why not try and suffer those casualties in an attempt to win a decisive victory, or at least a very important victory? And to the generals, who of course have to answer to politicians as well, that's what draws them on. But this idea about constantly trying to innovate and constantly trying to find new methods to actually make the attacks work, in the round, this is true of all the Allied armies. They have to do this. That doesn't mean they get it right immediately. Particularly early attacks in 1915 and even into 1916 often are poorly organized. The armies are trying to learn, and the tragedy, of course, of learning on the Western Front is you pay for your lessons in blood. And the development of different ways to get across no man's land, to get into the enemy trenches, and then to continue the fight in the enemy trenches is really the heartbeat of how armies develop in the First World War. They are striving, certainly the Allied armies, and to an extent the Germans, certainly by 17 and into 18, all the armies are striving for the solution of how do you launch a frontal attack against an extremely heavily defended position, capture that position with acceptable casualties. And all the innovations, the Western Front, or nearly all the innovations, are driving at that point. And of course, one thing I think we forget too is, yes, 1915, 16, 17 are ghastly years for the Allied cause. And 1918 is an extremely bloody year as well. But ultimately, the Allies do succeed in this. They do break up the Western Front. We've discussed many times that the latter half of 1918, the 100 Days campaign, looks completely different to 1917 or 16. But the getting there, the development of these methods that are going to break the line and are going to improve your ability to carry out a frontal attack, it's a pretty ghastly ladder to climb, Dan.
It is. And as you were talking there, I was thinking about the different options here and really how I think to an extent you can break down this evolution or this development into two different schools. One is things that are going to protect your own troops in the advance, and the second is things that are going to knock out enemy troops in their advance as well. So destroy enemy, protect your own troops. They're really the two kind of methods that we see. In fact, really when we see success, and particularly talking about 1918, is where you get a new method or a new method of technology that does both at the same time. Knocks out enemy troops and protects your own guys going forward. We're going to see this with artillery in a big way in 1918. Very, very effective, particularly when you start to see things like combined arms and the introduction of the tank and aircraft taking on new roles on the battlefield. That's maybe for a little bit further down the line on this podcast. But in terms of the story of actually how we get there, and I think possibly the memory of why maybe today, going back to the original premise of this podcast, the idea of frontal assaults and whether there's a perception that frontal assaults are absolutely futile and wasteful. Yeah, there is. There clearly is. And I, for my own part, want to make sure that I don't overstep my own thought process here and try and suggest that everything goes well and there are no errors made on the Western Front. Of course, there are big errors made, major issues in formal over-the-top assaults, and people are held to account, and rightly held to account for that. There are also these moments of evolution, and each of these small stepping stones is eventually going to lead to somewhere in 1918 where victory becomes a real possibility. But going back to the premise of this podcast episode and the idea of perception, I want to bring it back to the kind of popular question and put it to you, Spence, as to why do you think there is if you ask not necessarily a listener of this podcast, who I think are generally pretty learned about this subject, but if you go and tap somebody on the shoulder in the street in the UK or in France or the US and ask them, why they feel that the First World War is futile, what do you think is the main driver for our memory of this today?
Well, that's an episode in and of itself, but I think there's several things that contribute to this. One, as I mentioned earlier in the podcast, people do take part in attacks that to them feel futile. Whether you're a soldier or a young officer, if you go over the top and your company or your platoon is just shot to pieces before you even reach the German barbed wire, you may think, what a waste. I've lost, my friends, I've lost my men, I've lost my comrades, and for what? It felt like nothing. And you're going to search for someone to blame for that. And tragically, of course, these attacks do happen. There are companies that just never make it to the German trenches, let alone get into them. And if you're one of those officers, it can feel futile for what you're doing and create a sense of bitterness. And there's a novel in particular that really, not a novel, I should say, a memoir that really captures this and even gives it a word that we still use to describe this mood, this frustration with how the First World War was fought by those who fight it. And this is a memoir written in the 1920s called Disenchantment by a British officer called C.E. Montague. It's actually a very difficult book to read. Parts of it are really, really impenetrable. But he was a very patriotic, an older officer, very patriotic, very determined to fight. But by the end of the war, he was disillusioned with how the war had been fought. And so there was always this idea that was within the Allied armies in the First World War. And then it was given such voice in the 1920s and in the 1930s. The late 1920s especially, when All Quiet on the Western Front is released, and it completely changes the zeitgeist in the English-speaking world about how the First World War is perceived. Up until the release of All Quiet on the Western Front, there is a feeling that the war was bloody, it was hard fought, but it was worthwhile. That's the broad feeling. After All Quiet on the Western Front, disillusionment and disenchantment becomes really the order of the day, and the mood changes. And of course, it's changing at the same time as the Great Depression. Suddenly your sacrifices in the First World War feel futile because look at the economic crisis that the English-speaking world's living through. It's also affecting France and Germany very badly too. It all feels futile. All those sacrifices we made were in vain. And from that, growing bitterness develops, given in the English-speaking world an incredible shot in the arm by David Lloyd George, aforementioned, and also to an extent Winston Churchill, who publishes his own books in the 1920s, which again hint at this idea that the war could have been fought differently, largely if people had listened to Winston Churchill. And then from this idea just takes hold, and particularly Lloyd George's writing in the 1930s becomes incredibly influential. It's almost completely forgotten now, but it was incredibly influential in the 30s. It's picked up again in the 1960s, with the 50th anniversary of the First World War. The number of memoirs are reprinted. There's new books, which really draw upon Lloyd George's interpretation of the war. That it was futile, the generals were stupid, what a waste of human life. And really from that point on, I think in popular memory, we haven't really moved much further. This is a strong and enduring strain of thought. And one of the reasons it's strong and enduring is it's contrasted with the Second World War, where the moral ambiguities of the war seem less certain. They're more certain, I should say. There seems to be a much stronger moral cause for fighting the Second World War. In Britain, although this is often not widely recognised, military casualties in the Second World War are actually lower than the First World War, despite it being a longer war. And it's perception that it's a good war and it's well fought. And of course, the generals of the Second World War, certainly the British generals, are determined not to fight the Second World War as the First World War was fought. So that there's this whole mass of ideas and themes and writing that is creating this idea that the First World War was uniquely horrible, was uniquely difficult, was uniquely badly fought. And the Second World War is held up as a shining light. And, well, it could have been fought this way. And this was a better way to fight it for a better cause. And even now, even as we've passed the centenary, of course, in the 2010s, I'm not really sure that view has moved that much, at least with the general public. I think if you're really interested in the First World War or want to learn more, and you're listening to this podcast, of course, you can begin to see these differences. But it's an incredibly enduring idea. And I know, Dan, that you take lots of groups out on battlefield tours. You must have this discussion with your tour groups over and over again.
Absolutely. And I can give you from personal experience as well. I think one thing that at least from a British perspective here, apologies if our international audience don't quite have the same take on this subject, but there's one comedic show which came out in the late 80s and early 90s in the UK, which I think has had an enormous impact on the way we perceive the war today, certainly over the last 30 years or so. And that's the television series Blackadder. Blackadder goes fourth, the fourth series of that very, very interesting and rather funny series as well, which famously took on the First World War as part of that. And I think one of the things that makes Blackadder so powerful is, one, it's incredibly entertaining. Secondly, it's created at a time when the First War is just about in living memory. There are still people around who experience that. And thirdly, just quite simply, the way that it's created and the iconic ending of the series, which I do highly recommend. If anybody hasn't seen, they do check out. But at the same time, Blackadder also creates an enormous platform, particularly in Britain, for millions of people to watch it. And it compounds myth after myth after myth, to be perfectly honest, of things which are quite simply not true about the Great War. The famous bungling General Melchett, who talks about, sending men over the top 17 times in a row, and Blackadder, the hero of the piece, says, well, why don't we do something different this time? And his famous retort, well, that's exactly what they'd expect, so therefore what we won't do. Let's do it again for the 18th time. They'll never think that's going to be our plan. So there are all these kinds of these myths that are compounded in a very humorous way. But the reality is I've seen them skew into people's actual memory and interpretation of the war as a whole. And I can tell you from experience, when I was studying the First World War in history, some 25 years ago when I was at school, I was looking at this exact subject, and my history teacher thought, I'm going to play Blackadder Goes Forth. So that was part of our history curriculum at the time. This is how we learned about the First World War. If you want to watch something very funny, go ahead and watch Blackadder Goes Forth. If you want to learn history, do not do it with Blackadder Goes Forth as one of your guiding lights. And I think, Spence, actually, there's one myth that I think is most persistent when it comes to the story of frontal attacks that at least from my point of view, I think we can draw directly towards Blackadder as a series in the UK. And that is quite simply the idea of people walking slowly towards the enemy machine guns. This is something that is really heavily. This is something that's really heavily focused on in the series, and something that if you ask somebody in the street, absolutely, it's going to come up really quick.
This is so true. And listeners who've been listening to the entire series, you might remember I shared an anecdote where this happened to me way back before the centenary. I was at a British Army base. I was checking in, talking to my host who was attending a conference, and just talking about my work researching the British Army in the First World War and how the British Army learned in the war. And the desk guard, he was a very gruff Scottish soldier, an older Scottish soldier. He told me bluntly, I'll tell you what the British Army learned. It learned how to send men walking slowly into machine guns. 60,000 dead on the first day of the Somme. That's what they learned. And got his casualty figures slightly wrong. But what really struck me, and it still strikes me now, is how vehement and how obviously animated he was about this. He was very, very angry about this. He clearly he felt this. Perhaps he'd had an ancestor who'd fallen at the Somme. Perhaps that animated him. But his view is by no means unique. This is a very, very common view. And the fascinating thing about this is, like a lot of enduring ideas, there's an element of myth to it, but there's also an element of truth to it. Because in some cases, at various times in the First World War, both British and French troops would advance slowly against enemy positions. And if that went wrong, if the enemy defenders were not suppressed, if they weren't being pinned down by artillery or kept busy by tanks or anything like that, then walking towards the enemy line slowly or in an organized way was a recipe for total disaster. And the first day of the Somme, the 1st July 1916, famously as the bloodiest day in the history of the British Army, the whole concept, I think, in the British memory of walking slowly towards the enemy and being mown down really stems specifically from this individual battle. And that what makes it so interesting is there is a certain element of truth to this. And it stems, in fact, from some guidelines that are produced in early 1916, produced by the army commander who's overseeing this battle, Henry Rawlinson, which are really tactical tips and advice for the battalions that are about to go into battle. And amongst various other tips, one of the things he says is, and I'm quoting from memory, I don't have the exact document in front of me, but he talks about advancing at a steady pace is better than trying to rush the enemy in one great big go. And if you take this completely out of context, it's easy to then go, well, he's telling them to walk slowly towards machine guns. But he's actually trying to emphasize two other things. One, if you rush the enemy, your line is going to get ragged. No man's land in parts of the Somme is quite wide. We're talking several hundred yards. If you're running across there with your 30-man platoon carrying heavy equipment, you're going to wear your platoon out. You're going to arrive at the German lines and you're going to be ragged. You're going to be scattered. The fitter guys are going to be up ahead. The slower guys are going to be puffing and blowing behind you. You're going to be scattered all over the place. It's going to be very difficult. It's a long run. By the time you reach the German lines, you're going to be completely shattered. And crucially, if you hit the German lines before the guys on your left and your right hit the German lines, well, the Germans are just going to concentrate on you and they're going to blow you to pieces. You're going to be mown down. And then the guys on your left and right are going to arrive and hit the line. And what's happened? Well, their flanks are now open. The Germans are going to pour fire into them. And so this idea about advancing at a steady pace might seem folly because I suppose our natural human reaction is somebody's shooting at me and I've got to get at them. What's the best way to do it? Well, I go as fast as possible. The slower I am, the more shots they're going to have, the more dangerous it is for me. But in the context of a huge battle across a multi-mile front involving tens of thousands of men, this idea about trying to maintain a steady pace of attack actually makes some kind of sense. The tragedy is that some units do approach quite slowly, the steady pace. But there's another reason actually for them doing this beyond protecting their flanks and not exhausting themselves. And that this is a battle of multiple parts. It's not just the infantry advancing. It's also how does the infantry coordinate with the masses of artillery that are behind the lines. And at the Battle of the Somme, Dan, timing is really everything when it comes to artillery.
Yeah, absolutely. Timing is going to be crucial. And this is something that we've covered a number of times, particularly when we dived into the Somme episode quite a way back now. And we looked at a couple of key things. I think timing is certainly important in context of both artillery, but also communications on the battlefield. So I'm in entire agreement with what you said there, Spence. Particular reference to the idea of hitting the enemy line in some kind of concerted numbers, broadly at the right time, and broadly in large enough numbers to really overwhelm those enemy positions. There is, of course, the follow up point to that, and that's if you do go rushing into an enemy position, getting that first front line is only a very small part of the job. You've still got a long old fight ahead of you. So conserving energy and having enough energy to fight once you get there is still going to be a big part of your day. So crossing no man's land, whilst it is undoubtedly the most terrifying part of the soldier's ordeal, it's only a very small part of what their actual objectives are. But in terms of offering protection and going back to this idea of things that can protect troops as opposed to things that will knock out troops, and the Somme is a good example of where both are used and both fail, in fact, on the opening day. The idea of advancing at a steady pace means that you can also offer steady protection. And this is the idea of putting down a screen of artillery to protect your troops as they cross through no man's land. This is the famous creeping barrage, rolling barrage, jumping barrage, as it will later develop into. But the idea is using your own artillery to protect infantry as they move forwards. Now, if, as you've described, Spence, you've got platoons running at different speeds, all over the battlefield, hitting the line at different points, very, very difficult to maintain a close barrage there that's going to be able to protect your troops. And as we discussed in the artillery episode, the real key point here is not necessarily how far ahead you can put that artillery screen. It's how close your infantry can get to that protective barrage. If they can get very close, they're going to have a great amount of protection. The real danger lies in that barrage going over the top and there being a delay between the barrage passing on and the infantry arriving, because that's the point when the enemy are going to emerge from their trenches and get on those machine guns. And if that gap is too long, it's going to be an absolutely deadly day for the attackers. So in terms of being able to predict the speed of advance, very, very important. Get your guys going at an absolutely measured and steady pace all along the front. Keep them going at the same speed if at all possible, and give them as much artillery protection as you possibly can. Now, that doesn't always work, as we see on the 1st of July 1916, but the concept, Spence, is certainly not a bad one.
No, it's not. And it goes back to a point we were making at the start of this podcast about armies trying to find ways to carry out frontal assaults which are going to work, and they're going to work with an acceptable, ghastly word in the context, but an acceptable level of casualties. And certainly from a British perspective in 1915, that had not been met at all. The casualties being suffered relative to the ground gain and the damage inflicted on the Germans completely unacceptable, cannot be sustained. And one of the reasons for that was the British artillery, still poorly equipped, not enough ammunition, not really high enough level of training, would carry out bombardments, try and shatter the German lines, but then it would be very difficult for it to continue fire. And one of the big lessons of 1915 the Royal Artillery has is we've got to keep firing for as long as we can to try and, in a way, walk the infantry onto their target. The problem with that is it's all timing. The artillery that are firing can't see the infantry. You just can't see it. The artillery is thousands of yards back. The infantry is at the front line, is wreathed in smoke and flame and explosions. So the only way you can solve this problem is very, very strict timing. And we are talking strict timing, particularly in 1916. The armies are still learning how to coordinate this timing. In fact, one of the tragedies of 1916 is too often the timing doesn't work. The barrages are too fast, or they change targets too quickly, and the infantry can't keep up. But it's a genuine attempt to solve this problem, because from a German perspective, if you are manning your trenches and you see the British or the French or even the Americans coming towards you and nobody's shooting at you, well, that's a very easy day for you. You can just man your guns, man the parapet and mow them down. But if you're manning those trenches and there is a hail of shrapnel and high explosive shells hitting your trenches at the same time, well, suddenly it becomes very difficult. You're going to take casualties. Your position's going to be made untenable potentially, and you're not going to be able to deliver fire. And so this timing issue of the infantry advancing whilst the artillery is still firing and hopefully reaching the German trenches just at the moment that the artillery moves off onto its next target, because you don't really want to have to advance through your own barrage, it's going to inflict casualties on you, becomes really, really crucial. And in 1916, communications between the infantry and the artillery are still pretty basic. They're improving, but it's really incremental improvements. The only way you can do it is with very strict timings, because if something goes wrong, if the infantry can't keep up, there's no way for them to signal back to the artillery. Oh, we've lost the barrage. In fact, that's the phrase that's used. We've lost the barrage. The barrage is too far away from us. Bring it back. Later on in the war, there's methods to do this, although they're not 100% reliable. But in 16, there's basically no method to do it. And so the solution to that is we'll try and make sure it never happens at all. Very carefully coordinated timings. And that is, again, a crucial factor that's underpinning this idea of a steady pace. But on the other hand, Dan, a steady pace does not necessarily mean a slow walk. It can actually mean a whole bunch of things, because if you can advance at double time consistently over no man's land, that is also a steady pace. If you are advancing in a series of rushes, but you know you're going to cover 300 yards in 8 minutes, that can also count as a steady pace. And so, in fact, actually on the first day of the Somme, despite everything we've just said about steady pace and the importance of maintaining your timing with how the barrage is landing, in actual fact, battalions are given quite a lot of leeway on how they choose to attack at the Somme.
That's right. And this is something that's pretty much across the board misunderstood. Perhaps a number of you guys listening into this now will know that, but many others won't. Quite simply, the idea of every battalion getting out of their trenches, that famous phrase which does the rounds and is in fact used prior to the attack, that everything's going to be killed, not even a rat, and therefore a man can light his pipe, sling his rifle over his shoulder, and walk across no man's land without encountering a German. This is the typical picture that we've got of the Western Front, and the idea of these lads famously doing exactly that and walking into machine gun fire is a horrific one. It sticks in our memory, and understandably why, and understandably so. But the reality is, for the vast majority of battalions on that morning going over the first wave, they're certainly not lighting pipes, and they're certainly not shouldering their arms and strolling across no man's land. In fact, some really interesting work has been done by British historians Pryor and Wilson, a study in their 2006 book, which we'll link in the description actually to this podcast episode, which looks at the 80 battalions that go over the top on that first wave on the first morning, which is going to be the 1st July 1916. And they look at every one of those 80 battalions and they look at their method of attacking. And what they find is that 53 of the 80 battalions are actually going to creep into no man's land prior to the attack going off. And they're going to cut down the distance to be covered between their own trenches and the German front lines. And they're going to rush the German front line, albeit hopefully at a fairly steady pace. It's a rush at a steady pace, which sounds a bit ridiculous. But the idea is to hit in a concerted effort, hit the line at the same time. So shorten down the area of no man's land. 53 of the 80 battalions attacking are going to be doing that. None of those guys are going to be walking that morning. Another 10 are going to be rushing the German line from their own trenches. Typically, this is where the ground is going to be a little bit better, or there may be some local conditions which mean that attacking from their own trenches is going to be more profitable. But so that gives us 63 of the 80 attacking battalions. Of the remaining 17, only 12 are noted as actually advancing at a steady pace. So that's the phrasing that's used. The vast majority of those is going to be because they're behind a particularly methodical barrage, which we've described before, is in effect its own method of attack. Not necessarily a pointless, slow meander towards an empty German position, hoping for the best, but rather being protected by a methodical, powerful, well-planned, well-timed, and hopefully well-executed artillery barrage. In fact, those remaining 12 battalions, some of the greatest success seen that morning is actually achieved by those that do attack with that inverted commas steady pace. The other 5 of those 80, we're actually not sure exactly what their orders were on that day in terms of their method of assault. But it goes to show that whilst attacking, walking being one of the possibilities, not everybody wants to go for that. Some people use a hybrid. Some people adopt a completely different method. But it's really down to battalion commanders, brigade commanders, and those guys on the ground who can look at the ground and say, well, what's going to work best for me?
It is. And this is all part, of course, of British doctrine, which from before the First World War has emphasized the importance of the man on the spot, the battalion commander or the even junior officers to make the final decision, to look at the battlefront in front of them and decide what they're going to do. And in some ways, you could say that the doctrine is working as intended at the Somme, because as you've laid out, Dan, there's such variation in how infantry battalions attack. The tragedy for the 1st of July is, in some ways, it doesn't matter how you attack on the 1st of July, because the artillery has not done its job. It's not completely smashed the German defences as intended. If you'd like to know more about that, listeners, do listen to our Somme episode. And so the German defenders are not suppressed. In some cases, the wire is not properly cut. German artillery is largely untouched. And so when the attack begins, there's so much incoming fire on the British assault. It doesn't matter whether you're walking, running, you're dashing and going prone. You're just taking so much fire. It's just incredibly difficult to advance. With some exceptions, notably, of course, in the southern end of the battlefield, where almost everything actually goes right. And one thing to say, actually, about the Battle of the Somme, particularly the 1st of July and the weeks and months that will follow, is the army goes through a really brutal experience on the Somme. And it learns more and more about, well, how do we actually cross no man's land? What is the best way to do this? How do we advance in such a way that we don't lose the barrage, which is really quickly established as that's the key to victory? If you can keep artillery firing on the Germans, then you can actually get quite close to them, or at least close enough to them where you've got a fighting chance. You can throw grenades at them. You can potentially charge into their position. If you don't have that, if you lose the barrage, you're in serious trouble. You're going to be pinned down. You're going to really suffer. And it leads to the development of things like creeping barrages. Creeping barrages, I think, would be a great topic for a future episode. Very complicated, fascinating development. Essentially, a wall of shells walks across no man's land, and the infantry, the assaulting infantry, follows as closely behind it as they can. And British and the French both use this method. So actually the Germans in 1918. The Germans give it the wonderful name a fire waltz. Literally, you are dancing with the fire as it marches forward. And the idea behind this is the artillery rolls forward. It creates this blanket. It actually gives you some visual cover. There's explosions in the air. There's smoke in front of you. It's difficult for the enemy to see through it. It's psychologically very threatening for the enemy because this barrage is clearly moving towards them. It's going to hit you sooner or later. Very frightening to see it advancing on you. And very close behind it, and we're talking seriously close, within 50 to 100 yards in some cases, is a mass of Allied infantry. And so the barrage will roll over the German position, and almost the moment it's finished rolling over that position, suddenly a load of Allied infantry in the trenches. But these creeping barrages move at a set pace. Initially, the barrages are actually found to move too fast. And the infantry is running to keep up with them. They can't keep up. They get left behind. Problems follow. In fact, as the war goes on, and particularly you see this quite a lot in some of the big assaults of 1918, like on the Hindenburg Line in September 1918, is the infantry behind the creeping barrage walks because the barrage is moving so slowly. It's basically pointless to dash and run. And you want to stay as close to it as possible. You don't want to be separated from it. And so perversely, you start to see people moving slower in some battles, not all, but in some battles of 1918, because timing with the artillery is everything. And gradually, as the Allies begin to master these methods, we actually see different approaches to crossing no man's land. But there's other reasons, too, about how crossing no man's land and making a frontal assault not only change, but gradually become more and more successful. And I think a big one, Dan, is combined arms.
Yeah, absolutely. And we've really got to go back to those elements that we've covered more recently on episodes. And a big part of this, and I think we can still include artillery in this equation, is and we discussed this a lot when we looked at the artillery episode. If you take the Somme in 1916, for example, huge numbers of the total available guns that are involved in that fire are going to be used in doing things like breaking up barbed wire. Now, by the time we get to 1917 and 1918, a couple of things have come in that really take away a lot of the requirement of artillery to be used, or as much artillery to be used to achieve that. One is an introduction of the 106 Graze fuse, which is quite simply more effective at cutting barbed wire. And the second is bringing in things like tanks. Now, when you can bring in a tank that can crush barbed wire and create paths for the infantry, not only does it allow the infantry itself to move through, but it also means that you now don't have to dedicate 25% of your artillery firepower just to knock out that barbed wire. In fact, you can now put that extra 25% on German counter-battery fire or on knocking about the enemy rear areas. That in turn is going to mean the ground is less cut up. It's going to mean the tanks themselves can move through further. It means the infantry can move at a slightly higher pace. It's going to allow everything to move that a little bit better. And you start to see things, I think, in the sense being more joined up. We now have aircraft able to roam the skies in 1918. They're able to report down to tanks and report back to artillery forward observers, and they're able to highlight key points. We're also going to be able to see things like mobile support vehicles coming up, infantry being able to be supplied on the ground by tanks carrying equipment and ammunition. These are the kind of things that are pie in the sky in 1915 and 1916. But once, and this is a big thing about frontal assault, and where at least to my mind, where a major shift occurs, it's not necessarily that there's one smoking gun in terms of breaking through and maintaining, being able to finally destroy the idea of the power of a frontal assault, or the power of a defense against a frontal assault, I should say. But once that momentum starts to be gained, if it can then be maintained, then we can see real progress. And that thing that the generals of 1915 are hoping for, the into the blue attack, which is going to see a real breach in the enemy front line, and finally an opportunity to exploit behind the enemy positions, that only really becomes achievable when all of these hard learned lessons start coming together. And that doesn't really happen until mid 1918.
This is something I think we've revisited many times in various forms on the podcast. This development, the way the war changes so much from 1914 to 1917 and 1918. And what's driving it is the generals have to solve the problem of frontal assaults. You've got to find a way to break the Western Front or accept that you've lost the war. And of course, as we've discussed in previous episodes, you can't simply say, Britain cannot say to France and Belgium, well, bad luck, you're occupied by an invading power, you're going to have to give up. And certainly France is not prepared to do so. It's going to fight tooth and nail to liberate itself. And so it generates and drives a style of warfare involving these assets you've mentioned: tanks, aircraft, artillery, infantry that are fighting in modern platoons with a variety of equipment like machine guns, grenades, mortars, everything you can think of, everything we've discussed in many episodes, creates armies that look, to our eyes, quite modern. They've got all the things that the armies of the 20th century will effectively have. And that technology will, of course, improve as the 20th century goes on. But the building blocks of it, the key elements of it, are all in place by 1918. And it's all being driven, of course, by this need to solve this problem. How do you assault an enemy defensive position that you must attack frontally, that is protected by obstacles and is, of course, packed with firepower? And ultimately, of course, the Allies do find a way to solve this. It doesn't mean that they solve it without bloodshed. Both the learning experience to reach this point is very bloody, and even the battles of 1918 are very bloody. Even as the Western Front gets broken up, this is still intense fighting with very high casualties on both sides. And it's quite instructive, actually, I think, to sort of see by 1918, both sides can start to break the Western Front up. We start to get what historians call semi-mobile warfare, where people are still digging in, still entrenchment and foxholes, but the Western Front itself crumbles away. And you get a war that looks a lot more like the Second World War, like Battle for Normandy, or the advance into Germany in 1945. But of course, there's an army, and I think this is an interesting example, and I know we're planning to do more episodes about this army. There's an army that arrives on the Western Front really in 1918. It starts to arrive a little bit before that, which I think serves as an interesting example about what happens when an army arrives that hasn't had that bitter experience between 15, 16, and 17, that hasn't yet mastered the art of the frontal assault, that hasn't yet mastered combined arms warfare. And what are their experiences like? And that's the American Expeditionary Force, which arriving in 1917, but really coming into action in its own in 1918. As I say, I'd love to cover it in a future episode, or future episodes, really, because there's so much to say. But the American Army hasn't been able to really train to a level perhaps it would have liked to. It's coming out relatively quickly, completely inexperienced officer corps, completely inexperienced soldiers, and a doctrine that's really imposed from the top, which is emphasizing a different style of fighting. And these men fight incredibly bravely and with great determination. But against the Germans are actually surprised by how the Americans fight, Dan.
Yeah, the doughboys of the AEF. I mean, let's get it right. Incredible bravery they show in 1918, and they're coming out with very high morale at a time when morale is actually quite difficult to come by in any positive sense on the Western Front. So there's a real desire amongst the Americans to take the fight to a war weary Germany when they arrive in big numbers, really, in 1918. And of course, they're going to play a significant part in the final offensives, which are ultimately going to end the war on the Western Front. But before that happens, you've got the point where the German Spring Offensive really is coming to a close, and you start to see those first pushes back against those tired Germans. But bear in mind, they're tired but experienced Germans. up against enthusiastic, high morale, but very inexperienced American formations. And they're going to, in truth, pay some very, very bloody costs. In what has sometimes been described, and there's a little bit of a question about exactly where this phrase comes from, but there's some suggestion that of at least German officers referring to fighting the American army in 1918 a bit like fighting the British or French infantry of 1914, but with their own troops of 1918 mindset. I mean, we see some pretty horrific frontal assaults, which are going to be very bloody and very costly. And if there's any way to learn a lesson quickly, it's by losing a hell of a lot of guys in a short period of time. And Spence, as we know with everything, there is a steep learning curve. But it's got to be said, the Americans do adapt very quickly.
They do, and they have to, for reasons that are not dissimilar to the British and the French experience in 1915. You can't ask for your men to overcome fixed defenses with courage alone. You have to coordinate. And perhaps one of the most remarkable things from the AEF is that at times they do carry out successful attacks with sheer blood and guts. And I'm thinking particularly of the US Marines assault at Belleau Wood on the 6th of June, 1918, which is a frontal assault into a defended tract of woodland that by all rights should have been stopped. The Germans have masses of machine guns and artillery indeed registered on the assault pattern of the Marines. And the Marines fight their way into the wood through incredible courage and bravery, taking enormous casualties as they do so. But the American army does learn. It learns painfully, and the fighting up at down, I should say, at the Meuse Argonne in the latter half of 1918 is a lesson about just how vicious frontal assaults can be, even against a tired and, in some ways, a crumbling German army, still capable of fighting hard, but gradually falling to pieces behind the lines. The American experience there is extremely vicious and prolonged. Again, a battle I'd love to study in greater depth. But I'm reminded of a quote I think I may have used on this podcast before, which almost certainly apocryphal, but too good not to share. And supposedly it comes from Rommel in the Second World War, who said, "You can always beat the Americans, but you'll never beat the Americans the same way twice." Almost certainly apocryphal, but such a pithy line worth sharing here. I think that actually captures something about how the Americans adapt in the First World War too, because they have to. Because if you're going to keep asking your troops to do the impossible, just as the British and the French had done in 1915 to an extent in 16, you're going to destroy your army fairly quickly. And so adaptation has to follow. Otherwise, you're going to lose the war pretty quickly. And I think in a way, and as we come to the end of this episode, I think in a way that gives a lie to the idea that the armies just do the same thing over and over and over again. The armies do learn, they do adapt, they do try and improve methods, equipment, styles of attacking, because they have to. If you don't do this, then you're going to lose the war. And perhaps no more clear example of this, I think, is by late 18, and you see this a lot with the British and British Empire troops, you actually get soldiers are being ordered to walk again in the latter part of 1918, so they can stay very close to the barrage. And you've also got another factor there that by late 18, you've got a lot of conscripts in the British Army. About half the British Army has become conscript by then. These are men who perhaps haven't had the best training. They might not have the highest morale. What's the best way to stop them panicking or getting ragged or getting out of position? Well, get them to walk, get them to follow these massive barrages that are rolling across towards the enemy instead. And so we might say walking slowly towards the enemy is the epitome of stupidity. And if you do it without fire support, it's going to get you killed. But I think it's a measure of how the armies have adapted, how the armies have evolved to overcome fixed defenses, to carry out successful frontal assaults, that in the last few months of 1918, after the Hindenburg Line is gone, frequently we see British and British Empire troops told to walk closely behind the barrage. And yet when we think of futility in the war, when we think of walking slowly towards machine guns, we never think about those successful attacks where the troops are ordered to march slowly behind the barrage that are taking place in 1918. And yet, Dan, I think this epitomizes the slow, bloody, no doubt bloody, the slow and bloody evolution of warfare, but ultimately the successful evolution of warfare too.
Yeah, absolutely. Like everything when it comes to the story of the war on the Western Front, it is of course that learning curve. And breaking the deadlock of trench warfare is something that we've covered a number of times up till now. But really, it's the story of the frontal assault, and I'm really glad we focused on that today because that's really at the heart of the conundrum of how to break trench warfare. And quite simply, we see that finally by 1980, and when that does get achieved, it is going to ultimately pave the way for victory on the Western Front. You've been listening to Not So Quiet on the Western Front, a Battle Guide production. If you've enjoyed this podcast, why not check out the Battle Guide YouTube channel, where we regularly release documentaries exploring some of the most famous and extraordinary episodes from throughout military history. If you'd like to support the Battle Guide team to create more content just like this, why not head over to our Patreon, where for the cost of just a cup of coffee, you can get access to full-length virtual battlefield tours, exclusive behind-the-scenes content, decide which subjects we cover in future podcasts and videos, and join a fantastic community of like-minded people. That's all this time. See you again soon. And then eventually overcome the dangers of making a frontal assault on the Western Front are the same guys that ultimately emerged victorious at the end of the First World War. It was a bit arty at the end there, maybe a bit too much. I don't know.
No, I liked it.
I'm
I
not
thought
sure.
it
I'm
no,
not
I
sure.
like that. Although it does remind me of the time when Stuart Mitchell gave you a bad essay mark when you were talking about Tommies with their bayonets and all that.
Yeah, it did. No, we might lose that. I don't know. Linus, see how it sounds. If not, put it in the outtakes as a cheesy cheesy element.